So, what in your experience is the most important requirement for the job?
Oh, gosh. Well, there's two things really. You've got to be holy. You've got to want to follow God and do whatever He asks of you. And that means a total commitment. It reminds me of when I was at boarding school playing rugby. Not that I was particularly good at that either, but if you're not committed, you're going to get hurt. There has to be a serious focus and commitment. And Christ talks about counting the cost. He even uses phrases that people find very difficult than I do, that you've got to hate your family in comparison to the love you have of Him. And the most important commandment Jesus talks about is to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, thy mind, thy body, thy soul. And then to love thy neighbour as thyself, being the second most important commandment. So love of God and obedience to God, a holiness. But really, when you're dealing with people, and really that's the Holy Commission, down here on earth, if we are going to deal with people, whether we're a counsellor or a policeman, a fire officer, a doctor, there's got to be a love of people. And funnily enough, you know the doctors that don't love you or don't care about you. You can always tell, and it's not just what they say or what they do, it's their mannerisms, their body language, their tone of voice. If we don't love God, don't bother. And if you don't love people, really don't bother. Because you're dealing with people, you're sacrificing, you're interceding for them, you're helping them. There's not really a lot coming back, as I said earlier, for yourself. So if you don't care about people, what are you doing it for? It won't work. And if you're doing it because you think it's going to raise you up, or you're going to be somebody special, and people are going to give you plaudits or praise, like the Pharisees, that's all you're going to get down here. It won't actually work. So you've got to want to follow God. You've got to be able and willing to give up everything you own. And as the rich young ruler couldn't and walked away, you've got to ask yourself in the 21st century if we're not really all rich young rulers. We've all got an awful lot to lose in one sense. But as Christ says, if you try to hold on to your life, you'll lose it. And if you lose it for my sake and for the kingdom, you'll gain it. So there's got to be a sense of sacrifice, of death to self. And I remember when that happened to me. It's a really interesting experience. On a road near us as a boy, my parents used to drive me back and forward to school. And it went past this long drop down to this lake, the road. And it was on quite a tight curve. And at that time, there was just a little white picket fence that sort of bounded the road. And as we went round this, my dad used to be quite an enthusiastic driver, and as we went round this on the way to school, or particularly on the way back, because that was on the left-hand side of the road, as I could peer over the edge down to the icy water below, I'd look down here and think, one day we're going to come off, I'm going to die on this stretch of road, I'm going to come off through the picket fence. And one day, in fact, there was a car that had gone through it, and it was down there. It hadn't ended up in the lake, but it was right next to it, and I thought, well, when it happens to me, we're definitely going in the water. Well, it didn't happen. And yet, funnily enough, decades later, when I was in my early 40s, I was with the main Deliverance minister for the Church of England in our area, and clearly God was starting to move and guide me in this direction. And I was sat with him, and we came round this corner in the road, and he was talking about what was required, what you had to do to be an exorcist, to do that kind of work, which I now knew to be real and felt was called into it. And he was talking about giving his life up. And he'd lost his wife, and he believed through that she was cursed by a group he was dealing with. And as I came round the bend, this particular bend in the road, he was driving, it suddenly hit me in a sort of really fundamental way. That was the end of me. And what I mean by that was the end of my self-determination, my ideas of what I was going to do, my future. It was all just laid flat in front of him. Remind me of the Terminator film where she's driving along in the road and then there's just the lights shining in front of her, lighting up just the tarmac in the next sort of 20 feet or so, and that was it. And the future looked uncertain. And that's how it was for me. I had no idea what was going to happen, but I knew it was death, as Jesus talks about, to die to yourself and to be born again of the Spirit. Well, at this point, I really did die, but a more fundamental death on that corner in the road. So death to self, giving everything up, being prepared to follow God. But without love, as St Paul talks about, there's no point. Love is everything. Without love we are nothing. And so we have to love God, and we really have to love people, especially when people oppose us and fight us and say all sorts of terrible things about us. Can we still love them then? Not just when they're nice or pay you money, but when they actually can hate you, but your love for them is so great that you'll persist in the help and support they need despite how they treat you. And only real love can achieve that.